Welcome back to Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV. Josh Hasten here, correspondent for JNS News. I am in studio with Alex Traiman, CEO of JNS. Hope you're doing well. In your part of the world, we are going to dive right into the news here. Ceasefire negotiations between Israel and, well, not really Hamas. Hamas isn't present there. Egypt and Qatar trying to come up with some sort of bridge between all the sides in order to achieve a ceasefire, potentially. Talks being held in Doha over the weekend, and talks are also scheduled to take place this week in Cairo. Alex, what do we know so far about these negotiations?
Well, as you mentioned correctly, Hamas has neglected to send a formal delegation. So obviously they're being represented in some way by the Qataris or the Egyptians, and phone calls being made, but Hamas doesn't have its people in the room there, maybe because Ismail Haniyeh has got taken out a couple of weeks ago. We don't know how real these negotiations are. The United States is calling it the final chance. Doesn't really make sense this would be a final chance. As long as there's a war going on and as long as there's hostages going on, it would seem that there would be repeated chances over and over again to reach some kind of a hostage agreement. But when they talk about a final chance, perhaps it's about Iranian threats, which we'll talk about soon, or the threats from Hezbollah. The mediators, the Qataris, the Egyptians, the Americans saying they're all on the same page. They're pushing Israel to make accommodations in order to reach this agreement. Israel seems to be playing along, but like every single other negotiation since that first one several months back, we keep hearing that it's closer than ever, and ultimately a deal doesn't get done. We're not going to know what happens until we get an announcement.
One of the key demands Israel is making is that it maintain its presence in the Philadelphia corridor, and we'll talk about the importance of that also later on in the show. In addition to another route, the Netzarim route, one of the main routes there, connecting the two sides, the north and south of Gaza. Israel says it must maintain a security presence in those areas, and all the other parties are trying to, I guess, coax Israel into perhaps taking a step back from that position.
Yeah, we're also hearing that it's a complex deal, right? It's not something simple like you give us back our hostages and the fighting's over and we'll pull back to these lines. This is a deal that, if reached, would span over the course of many weeks with multiple phases of the deal. In the first phase, Israel would get back just over 30 hostages that are women, children, elderly, those that are considered the humanitarian cases, live hostages. And then in later rounds, if later rounds are even negotiated after a first round, only then would Israel see the soldiers that were kidnapped or the soldier-age males that were kidnapped. So even if a deal gets reached, there's still a lot of opportunities for either side to not make good on their commitments.
I saw one of the fathers of the hostages over the weekend who has a young son, I think maybe perhaps in the army or just out of the army, who's being held hostage by Hamas. He basically said, if this deal is signed, you're condemning my son and all of the other soldiers and young men. You're condemning them to death. That's what his point was.
And the other component of it is that Israel will release tons of security prisoners, as part of the deal. Now, Israel has taken reportedly up to 5,000 prisoners from Gaza since the war started, both those that crossed into Israel on October 7th and were apprehended in Israel, and also during the fighting, Israel has apprehended many individuals. But we're not only talking about releasing the Gazan fighters back into Gaza, you're also talking about those that have been arrested in Judea and Samaria and placed in Israeli prisons. And if you will recall, back in 2011, Israel agreed to a fateful hostage negotiations where Israel released over 1,000 terrorists in exchange for one soldier, Gilad Shalit. This was agreed to by Benjamin Netanyahu and his government. And one of those 1,000 terrorists that were released were the mastermind of October 7th, Yahya Sinwar.
Yeah, and we're going to get to this in just a few minutes. We've already seen some of those who were released in the November hostage negotiation deal already taking part in terrorist activity. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But first, let's talk about the Iranian threat, Hezbollah threat, which is looming over our heads. And I think a key here is it's been several weeks since Israel took out Fuad Shukar, the number 2 in Hezbollah, and also the death of Ismail Haniyeh, which Israel has still not claimed. But I would say at this point, Iran said yesterday that they have the legitimate right to respond. And the point for us, I think, is we should not be lulled to sleep. Just because Iran hasn't attacked us yet, Iran says they will retaliate. And actually, I was in Tel Aviv over the weekend, and I saw a top CNN crew checking into one of the hotels on Saturday evening. I thought
you can mention which reporter you could say.
I saw Wolf Blitzer and his team, and I thought, oh my gosh, he's checking in tonight. Maybe he's here to cover the Iranian attack. He knows something we don't. Again, just speculation. Well,
maybe you wanted to get a beach day in before the attack.
It's possible, but
it does seem pretty clear that the U.S. has cajoled Iran to hold back its fire to give the ceasefire negotiations a chance to succeed. Iran has said that they will attack at the time of their choosing. They see this as part of a psychological warfare game that they're playing, keeping Israel on edge. And I think that also at the same time, both sides getting ready, for what an attack or a counterattack could look like. Ultimately, we don't know what Iran is going to do. If Iran is looking for a way to step down the ladder, right, if they don't want to see Hezbollah, their larger terror proxy in Lebanon, wiped out the same way they've seen Israel degrade Hamas in Gaza, if they don't want to see Israel attack their oil refineries, their nuclear facilities, other strategic military sites, then maybe they will let a ceasefire go ahead and decide to cool the tensions in order to kick the can down the road till later, which is all that a ceasefire would be. Remember,
right,
when you make a ceasefire with the Arabs, it's not a peace treaty. Okay, it's called in Arabic a hudna. It is a temporary stopping of the fighting in order to allow the side that entered it, which would be the Arab side or the Iranian side, in their case, the opportunity to rebuild their arsenal until the time of their choosing when they break the ceasefire. That's why we had a ceasefire on October 6th, and they broke it on October 7th when they felt that Israel was vulnerable to attack. We don't know if Iran is going to attack. We're waiting. We don't know why Israel is waiting if they believe that an attack is imminent. Of course, if Israel launches first, that would mean a lot of international condemnation, and it would also mean the definitive counter response from Hezbollah and from Iran. So there's a lot of calculations here, and we're basically in a waiting game now during this hostage negotiations. We'll see what happens when they conclude, and they may get dragged out for some time.
Important point you make that the word is hudna. Hudna means temporary, as far as I know, and I'm not an expert in the Arabic language or in Farsi or whatnot. I don't think there's an actual word for peace deal, only hudna. That's the word that they're using. And by the way, the Iranian foreign minister, they're labeling Israel. They never say the word Israel. They won't even recognize the state of Israel. They called us a Tel Aviv-based criminal gang. So obviously not recognizing our rights to Jerusalem, saying the word Tel Aviv. I don't know if that's an allusion to the, to their possible target, the city of Tel Aviv. It could be Haifa, it could be Tel Aviv, but labeling it Tel Aviv, not saying Israel, not saying Jerusalem. Perhaps we'll have to pay attention to their wording a little bit more carefully. But the main point, as you said, hudna, not a peace deal by any stretch of the imagination. At the same time, Israel, over the last several days, destroyed 50 tunnels in the town of Rafah. That is, we're talking about the border between Gaza and Egypt. I think just a week or two ago, we talked about another 40 tunnels. So the point here is that if you were not convinced until now, this was an extensive operation between the country of Egypt and Gaza, with literally highways moving underground in which Hamas was bringing in weapons. Egypt turning a blind eye now for many years. At one point, they were actually taking action, I think back in 2015. Egypt, there's no way they can't claim we didn't know what was going on. Another 50 tunnels discovered in southern Gaza over the last several days.
You'll remember that the United States told Israel in the beginning, don't launch a ground operation. There's nothing to accomplish with a ground operation. You're just going to make everything worse. You're never going to be able to degrade Hamas. Israel went through the red light. They obviously launched their ground operation. And then as they pushed down from north to south in Gaza, we remember a few months back, the United States says, absolutely do not enter Rafah. If you go into Rafah, it's going to be a catastrophe in terms of the number of civilians killed. Of course, Israel has limited the number of civilians killed to unbelievable lows. I mean, for military not to have the type of civilian casualties is incredible, and Israel's done that. And what have they found in Rafah? We found hostages, we found tunnels, we found weapons caches, we found rocket launching sites. Israel was told, absolutely do not take the Philadelphia corridor, right? And we were told that that would mean all-out war with Egypt. Now, why were we told not to take the Philadelphia corridor? Because that would expose this tunnel system here. Some of these tunnels that were found, wide enough for trucks to drive through. Some go right under Egyptian military bases. And then we had a story in the New York Times just this week, which said that there are no further military gains to be had by an operation that Israel needs to stop right now. And since that report, what do we see? 50 additional tunnels found in Rafah, terrorists apprehended in Khan Yunis. Israel continues to degrade step by step Hamas's infrastructure, find their leadership. They're still working on intelligence, and I believe that if they keep going, there's a good possibility that they're going to get Yahya Sinwar and some of the other Hamas leaders, unless, of course, those leaders have been smuggled out of the Gaza Strip through those very tunnels that have been exposed.
Yeah, how do we know right now Sinwar isn't sitting on some beach in Australia, going through one of those tunnels and flying across the world? And that is definitely a fear of mine. I mean, I would think we would, capture him eventually or kill him eventually. And that is the reason why Jerusalem has maintained that a key to this whole operation is military control over the Philadelphia corridor there between Gaza and Egypt.
And
it's a must.
And this is what a lot of the hostage negotiations center on. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that Israel must maintain the right to continue fighting. Whether or not Hamas breaks its deal, they want to fully degrade Hamas, not only as a military organization, but also as a political organization. Control over the Philadelphia corridor. This is very important. They have to make sure that the smuggling that got us to the situation in which Hamas has all these weapons cannot continue after a ceasefire deal is reached. And also, Israel wants to make sure that terrorists that are in the south of Gaza do not migrate back up to the north, where they're a lot closer to the Israeli population centers of Ashkelon and Ashdod and elsewhere. So, Israel has these military security considerations that they're putting into their requirements for a ceasefire deal. The United States and Hamas obviously trying to push Israel back away from some of its demands, and we see a lot of leaks about this in the press.
Unfortunately, sad news. We got Saturday night, 2 IDF soldiers, both reservists, who were killed in different battles fighting in Gaza over the weekend. Reserve Major Yotam Yitzhak Pellet, 34, from Rosh Ayin, and Warrant Officer Mordechai Yosef Ben Shalom, also 34, from the neighborhood of Geva Binyamin, also known as Adam, in the Binyamin area just north of Jerusalem. So may their memories be for a blessing. Another 2 IDF soldiers killed.
And you
over the
see
weekend.
that we're still fighting, right?
Yes.
And you would think that what would a ceasefire agreement look like? It would mean that Hamas surrenders, they release all of the hostages, and in that case, and the senior leadership also surrenders to Israel. And in that case, Israel will stop fighting, and then we'll promise to help rebuild the Strip. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about some kind of, again, a Hudna arrangement, which just allows ultimately the United States to say that they've stopped the violence ahead of the elections. Of course, they're not really concerned whether or not the fighting will continue after the elections, because that's a highly likely scenario. And Israel would be able to get back some of, but not all of their hostages. So that's the choice, really, that are on the table for Israel.
And in terms of a ceasefire deal and a prisoner exchange, we are already seeing, just like the Gilad Shalit deal way back, in this current battle, we're seeing that prisoners who were exchanged for hostages, air prisoners, Hamas members, have already gone back to their old ways, returning immediately almost to terrorism. There were several Hamas members released in the November exchange. And here you have, over the last several days, an Israeli drone strike killed 2 gunmen who threatened troops in Balata, that is in Shechem, in northern Samaria. And one of those was an 18-year-old Walid Masha, who was freed from prison as part of the agreement. This was after he was arrested. And at the same time, you had another terrorist, Tariq Daoud, who opened fire on an Israeli man last week in Kalkilia, seriously wounded an Israeli. I actually saw a TV report about this. It was unbelievable how the IDF forces and security officials were able to track him down, corner him, and kill him. So these were 2 terrorists who were released in a hostage exchange. And again, I understand the families who are protesting. I understand that the family members are doing everything they can in order to get their loved ones home. But on the other hand, you do have to take into consideration that future Israelis, as this man was seriously wounded, could be hurt, could be killed if you let these evil people back out into the streets. And we saw it twice just over the course of the last week.
I think it's important to look at the ages of the 2 terrorists that you mentioned, both of them here in this report, 18 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that means that they were in prison from the time before they were 18 years old. Right now transfer over to Gaza for a minute. You have the Hamas Gazan Health Ministry death reports where they talk about women and children killed. Okay, so these people that were in prison, they were in prison most likely before they were 18 years old. Okay, so are those terrorists or are those children, right? And even at 18, they've come out of prison. Are they rehabilitated in prison? No, they're not rehabilitated in prison. In fact, they continue to be incited in prison, and they believe themselves to be part of the Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad military. Okay, so you're releasing fighters back out into the public, and there's no surprise that these individuals then go back to committing acts of terror, because that's what they're trained to do. That they believe that going into prison in Israel is a rite of passage. Okay, they believe that is it's a tremendous honor to have served in Israeli prison, and when they come out, they're just as radicalized as when they go in.
Yeah, and of course, Hamas obviously considers them children, doesn't call them terrorists or fighters or gunmen or whatnot. And as I've always said, it doesn't matter if you're 15 years old or 55 or 105. If you are armed and you carry out terrorist attacks, try to murder Israelis, age doesn't matter. I mean, our soldiers go into the army at age 18. They're obviously still teenagers, but they are legitimate fighters in an army. Well, these 17-year-olds are terrorists.
I'll tell you the big difference, okay? None of the 18-year-old Israelis that go into the army have committed acts of violence against Palestinians before they entered into the state's army, okay? They're not incited to do that, okay? If you look at the educational materials in Israel, Israelis are taught to pursue peace. Okay, our prayers are towards peace. Yeah, in Palestinian education system, they are incited to violence from an early age. It's in their textbooks. It's on their television. Yeah, people that are now in their 30s in Gaza, in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, they grew up watching a Mickey Mouse that in the last episode died as a suicide bomber. Okay, this is what the incitement machine looks like there. So it's not a surprise that the 14-year-old, 15-year-old kids, we see it all the time. A 14-year-old tried to stab somebody in a checkpoint or something like that. That is a common occurrence. And when we talk about the peaceful Palestinians, okay, and you hear that all the time, well, so many peaceful Palestinians have died, and there's a lot of peaceful Palestinians. First of all, I don't see any peaceful Palestinian leaders leading any kind of protest, not against the Hamas, not against Palestinian Islamic Jihad, not against the corrupt Fatah, the Palestinian Authority. But I also don't see any peaceful Palestinian leaders leading some kind of a civil disobedience movement, marching in the streets for freedom against Israel. Okay, that's not the path that they've picked. They've decided they want to take the land by war. Okay, they declare war, and through these acts of terrorism, they declare war through the worst massacre in the history of the modern state of Israel on October 7th. And then when we fight back the war, then Israel gets accused of killing the innocent Palestinian civilians. There are Palestinians that don't want war with Israel. Of course there are. But do you know what type of mental gymnastics they've had to do in order to overcome their upbringings and reach a conclusion on their own that everything that they've been taught from the time that they were kids was a lie? That's what has to happen for there to be an innocent Palestinian. And there are a lot of them that have done that, to work on their own. But That means they had to overcome their upbringing, they had to overcome their culture in order to reach that conclusion.
I've spoken to a lot of groups over the years who have come over from the U.S. and other countries to Israel, and the question that I usually get almost each and every time is, when will there be peace here between the Arabs and the Jews? And I tell people, don't even pay attention to what is being said in the halls of the Mukata in Ramallah or in the Knesset or what have you. Don't look at the leaders. Just focus on the education system. When you look at the Palestinian Authority education system, the Hamas, of course, education system, what they're being taught under UNRWA, using the UNRWA textbooks, as long as the next generation of Arab kids are growing up to hate Jews, to hate Israelis, being taught that martyrdom is the way to go, that's the path, then there won't be peace here. And I've said that many times.
Well, I disagree to a certain extent, because I believe that there can be peace here even if they are taught that. Okay, there can be peace if the Palestinians understand that despite their hatred for the Jews, that they have no means for defeating the Jewish people whatsoever. That if Israel is so strong and it's known that they're going to squash any kind of uprising at any time, there will ultimately be peace. And I think it's important to look at the situation inside Judea and Samaria. Yes, you have these isolated terror attacks. Also, you need to look at the situation inside Jerusalem, where you have 250,000 Arabs. You have to look at the mixed Arab-Israeli cities like Lod and Ramla and others. Remember, back in 2021, the last time we had a flare-up, there were massive riots in Lod and Ramla. Since October 7th, have there been any riots in Lod and Ramla?
Not yet.
There haven't been any riots.
No.
It could be that there might be in the future, but to this point, there hasn't been. There hasn't been a massive uprising in Judea and Samaria. Now, part of that is because the IDF has been very proactive in strategy, that's called mowing the grass, taking out the terrorists where they pop up. It's like a little bit of a whack-a-mole strategy there, but there hasn't been a mass protest in Judea and Samaria. There hasn't been a mass protest among the Arabs in Jerusalem. Remember, in 2014, we had in Jerusalem what was called the stabbing intifada, the car ramming intifada here. You're not seeing much of that because ultimately this really isn't a war between Israel and Palestinians. This isn't a flare-up of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is about Israel and Iran and its terror proxies. Hamas is one of Iran's terror proxies. And the reason why you're not seeing this flare-up is because the Palestinians recognize that they have a lot to lose if they do flare up. Right? If the war comes into Jerusalem, the Palestinians living in Jerusalem are going to suffer immensely, and they're going to lose their rights. So even though they're still being trained to hate Israel, even though the incitement still exists in the mosques, on the TV, and everything else, there can be peace when the Palestinians understand that they cannot win. And that is what Israel needs to establish.
How do you then deprogram them? I mean, you had 3,000 Hamas members in Gaza come over on October the 7th and carry out unspeakable acts of murder, barbarism, and whatnot. How are you able to deprogram, if that does, in fact, I mean, we've seen it historically. It has been present in Judea and Samaria, the Second Intifada, 2002, where buses were being blown up or cafes were being blown up on a daily basis, and they're getting this from their mother's milk. So what can you do to deprogram what's being instilled in them from a very young age?
I think it's a really important question, and this is why we see that the pullout from Gaza in 2005 was such a mistake. When you let the Palestinians have complete governance over themselves administratively, which includes also the television, includes also the education system, and it's the same thing in the Oslo Accords. In 1993, Israel signed the Oslo Accords, which was supposed to create the pathway toward a two-state solution, and it allowed for the creation of this Palestinian Authority, which controlled the Palestinian education and controlled the Palestinian television airwaves. Okay. If you want there to be real peace in the region, you have to take over the administrative control over some of these areas. You're Israel. You need to control the television station. Okay, you cannot allow for there to be incitement going on the airwaves. You need to be the one that prepares the textbooks for the schools. Okay, you can't have incitement. You can't have maps of the entire state of Israel with a Palestinian flag and a keffiyeh all over it, calling this thing Palestine. If you want people to understand that Israel is stronger, right? You're allowing the Palestinians to perpetuate a narrative. You have to be proactive with the messaging. You have to be, I'm sorry to say this, you can't have freedom of speech, completely freedom of speech. You have to be monitoring the social media channels. You have to, and if there's a problem with the social media channels and all incitement to violence, you have to shut down the social media channels. You have to make the narrative of hatred and incitement go away. That's the only way that you can do it. And you have to continuously demonstrate that there is no gain whatsoever from attacking Israel and turning your areas into Syria or into Lebanon, that you have much more to gain by normalizing relations the way the Emiratis have, the way the Bahrainis have, the way the Saudis are trying to move in the direction of, and to live side by side with Israel and the educational and economic opportunities that come with that. That's the basic formula. And until you really try it, you're not going to know if you're going to be able to deprogram the society.
So you mentioned a very important point here. This past week, we commemorated 19 years since the Gaza expulsion back in 2005. Israel decided to so-called disengage, I call it expel, almost 10,000 residents from Jewish residents from Gush, Katif, and northern Gaza and northern Samaria, pull them out. And Israel did not have a presence leading up to October 7th. We didn't have a presence on the ground. We didn't have the ability to go into the villages on a nightly basis that we have in Judea and Samaria in order to thwart terrorist attacks. You had several arrests being made. There were youth who were holding protests, Israeli youth trying to go back into Gaza to sort of reclaim Gush Katif, if you will. But one of the protesters made a good point here. He said only a Jewish Gaza will remove the threats of missiles and hostage-taking from Gaza and bring security to the residents of the South and the entire country. This is an anonymous Israeli who was trying to get involved in one of these protests commemorating 19 years since Israel made the mistake of pulling out of Gush Katif from Gaza.
Yeah, you know, Gaza was the pilot project for the independent Palestinian entity. Right? If the project had gone well, remember what people were telling us, Gaza is going to turn into the Singapore of the Middle East, right? You know, had it turned into the Singapore of the Middle East, you probably would have a two-state solution, right? Israelis might even have given up their biblical homeland of Judea and Samaria in order to have peace with the Palestinians. That's how badly Israel craves peace, that they would even give up their biblical homeland in order to get it. Of course, if you have to pull out all of your residents and even you have to rip out your cemeteries because you know that they're going to be desecrated the second you leave, then you're probably not going to have peace with those people. Now, why is the security situation different in Judea and Samaria than it is in Gaza? Because in Gaza, the IDF wasn't going in, okay? In Judea and Samaria, the IDF goes into these areas A, even, you know, that are Palestinian-controlled areas that will go into Ramallah. They will go into Jenin. They will go into Tulkarm. They will go into Qalqilia. They will go into Hebron when terror rears its head. But when you pull out of an area for completely and you don't allow yourself to secure that area, what happens? You see the buildup of tunnels. You see the buildup of rockets. The dissemination of assault rifles and IEDs like we've seen in Gaza. So this is what happened in 2005. It was a national sin. Remember, this was a left-wing policy. Amnon Mitzna, he campaigned against Ariel Sharon, the right-wing hawk. Mitzna said, you know, if I am elected, I will withdraw from Gaza. And Sharon said, well, the right wing's never going to do that. We're not going to withdraw from Gaza. And of course, the second he gets into office, you want a landslide victory. He then turned and he said, I'm going to do the left-wing policy. I'm going to pull out of Gaza. And everybody was scratching their heads. Why are they doing that? And we were told at the time, you know, if just one rocket comes in, you know, Israel's going to go back in and we're going to flatten Gaza. Well, guess what? We're how many? Maybe over 100,000 rockets later. Yeah. And thousands dead. Okay. And not just thousands of Israelis dead, thousands of Palestinians dead as a result of what happened. This was a huge national sin, and Israel is repaying that sin now with this war in Gaza. And I think it's important not to make the same sins again, not to say, look, even if you're not going to resettle Gaza with Jewish residents, okay, which I'm not sure that the international community would go for. I'm not sure that most Israelis are ready for that commitment, but the idea that the IDF shouldn't be able to flow freely inside Gaza and move as it determines is in its security interest, that has to remain. Israel cannot make the same mistake again. If you make the same mistake again, you know, it's fool me once, shame on you fool me twice, shame on me. Israel's just going to be back in the same situation time and again if it does not secure Gaza for the future.
I think it was back in 2003, 2004, Prime Minister Sharon said the fate of Netzarim is the fate of Tel Aviv, Netzarim being the Jewish community in Gush Katif in Gaza. And then a very short time later, he flip-flopped and decided to go for the disengagement plan. Switching gears here, this was an interesting headline. I don't know if this has been verified, but this did make the news here. U.S. leaked names of 10 Mossad agents to Tehran. The Biden administration leaked the names of 10 Mossad agents operating in Iran as part of a, quote, good faith initiative in response to Israel strikes, which were carried out without American coordination. Reported by the Jerusalem Post, citing anonymous sources. You immediately had denials in the United States. Then you had Senator Ted Cruz saying, I pray this is not true. If Joe Biden and Kamala Harris actually gave the Ayatollahs the names of undercover Mossad agents in Iran, it would be a level of betrayal of Israel and America difficult to fathom. So what can we make of this report? Any validity at this point? Has anything come to light? But this would be a damning, this would have damning implications if this were in fact the case.
Well, first of all, let's just deal with how the report came to light. This is citing anonymous sources from a Kuwaiti paper, and the Jerusalem Post is the ones that put this out there.
Right.
They're relying on the anonymous reporting of a Kuwaiti newspaper, okay, which says something about the Jerusalem Post, okay? A lot of the Israeli media outlets are not high quality. There's no way just to show you the difference between Jerusalem Post and JNS, for example. JNS will never rely on an anonymous source unless the JNS reporter knows the anonymous source personally and knows that there's an important reason why that source needs to remain anonymous. But if we cannot verify for ourselves who that source is, we're not going to run the story. Certainly not going to run an anonymous sourced story from another publication, but the Jerusalem Post will do that. And that's why you have this quote from Jason Brodsky, who's the policy director at United Against Nuclear Iran, saying that there's a report from Al Jazeera making their rounds with a story about a secret trip by U.S. officials to Iran that I do not believe. I think the Iranian sourcing for the report is disinformation aimed to increase polarization in the United States, as well as fissures between Israel and the United States. So, I think that that's an important view to take here, but there have been lots of reports, and this is important. There have been a lot of reports about the conversations between Iran and the United States, where the United States is doing everything that they can to try to prevent Iran from launching a strike on Israel. And what the United States is not doing is saying, if you attack Israel, it will be like you attacked us, and we will flatten you to the ground, and you will rue the day that you ever even thought about attacking Israel. That's not what's coming out in public. What is being reported in public is that the United States is trying to cajole Iran into not attacking. And so we've seen reports in the last week that the United States might pull out all of its troops from Iraq and Syria, right? Mm-hmm. Thousands of troops, which would essentially cede all of Iraq and Syria to Iranian influence, okay? Further entrenching Iran in these places and creating an even stronger land bridge between Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon all the way to Israel's border. Okay, that would be a horrific mistake, but we're seeing that these are the reports, and we can believe it because we saw how the United States just pulled out in the middle of the night from Afghanistan, right? We saw that. And we're seeing also these reports here that the United States leaked the names of the 10 Mossad agents, basically saying, okay, Iran, if this is true, it's basically saying, okay, Iran, you don't like it that Israel's operating inside your country and they're able to kill people in your secure compound. Okay, so we'll tell you who did it. You can go after them, but don't attack Israel. So that's some of the reports that are happening. Is it true? We can't ultimately know, but as long as the United States is projecting a sort of weakness in the region, then there has to be some shred of a doubt, which indicate that something like this could be true. We'll probably never know.
Weakness with Iran, weakness with the Saudis. We've talked about how the Saudis won't come to the negotiating table because of a weak administration there in Washington. I want to switch gears here on the Judea and Samaria front. there was an incident in the town of the village, I should say, of Jit in the northern Samaria area, just outside the Jewish community of Kadumim. Jit is a village. I actually was asking some Kadumim residents about what happened over the last several days. Apparently, some Arabs from Jit went out and started throwing rocks at Israeli cars. After that took place, a group of Israeli teenagers arrived. Not sure where they're from, perhaps not even Samaria. And according to reports, went into the village, and there were scuffles which broke out. And apparently, according to reports, some of the Israelis, some of the Jews set fire to vehicles, buildings, and from what I understand, somebody was in fact killed in this incident. Now you have condemnation from all over the world, from the United States, from the European Union and whatnot. And you actually have the head of the Samaria Regional Council, Yossi Dagan, telling people not to take the law into your own hands. That being said, according to Dagan and the head of the Kadumim Regional Council, Ozel Vatik, the person who was killed or reportedly killed was actually a terrorist. He was photographed as being a member or a supporter of what's known as the Lion's Den terrorist organization, which has been active in northern Samaria, who've been carrying out murder and terrorism. Again, I'm not saying that it's correct to go into an Arab village on your own and not rely on the IDF or whatnot, but on the other hand, a lot of the media doesn't report on how some of these things start. They don't talk about how Arabs instigate on a weekly basis. I know this for a fact. Anarchists show up at Jewish communities a lot of time on the Sabbath, and they start throwing rocks, and they start up.
I mean, you've personally been in a situation where Arabs were throwing rocks at your car, right?
No, I had to, it was a matter of life or death. I was in a near lynch back in 2015, just driving on the road to Jerusalem. That was my only crime, when 30 Arabs tried to attack my car. And I had to fire one round in the air in order to save my life. And I went through, I was investigated myself, and I was...
Right, so what happens, right, when somebody gives the call, right, to their Jewish village in the area that Arabs are, throwing rocks at Jewish cars or lynching, somebody's with a gun, right? We just saw... Just a week ago, there was yet another shooting in the Jordan Valley, right, where, just
somebody was murdered.
There's a sniper shooting at cars, basically, and you don't hear the international condemnation when Palestinians just open fire on random vehicles, and you've had thousands of Palestinian terror attacks on Jews, killing thousands of people, injuring thousands of others. And so what happens? Somebody's in the car, they're being attacked, they call back home, say, get me help, and then people mobilize, right? The IDF doesn't come right away. Maybe the IDF comes fast. In some cases, yes, some cases not. We saw what happened on October 7th. They didn't get there so fast. People come, and then there's confrontations, and things happen. And I think that the lesson should be for Israel, for the Israeli police, for the IDF, which is if you don't want Israelis to take the law into their own hands, and you see everybody from the prime minister on down saying that people don't take the law into their own hands. We leave that to the IDF. The reason why it's happening is because people in these areas don't feel safe. Okay, if they felt like the IDF was protecting them, and then then they wouldn't get attacked. I am 100% certain that Israelis, Jews would not attack Palestinian villages if they were living peacefully next to those villages, right?
No doubt.
It's only when they get attacked repeatedly that Israel goes back in. And we saw it about, I guess it was a year ago with Huwara, right? You heard all about the Israeli attacks on the Palestinians. How many shootings attacks were there on that road, right? That very road. It was just attack after attack after attack. People got shot. People got killed. And when the IDF doesn't take care of the situation and people don't feel safe, they're going to take the law into their own hands. So you don't want people taking the law into their own hands. I 100% agree with the comments from the prime minister and everybody else. People should not take the law into their own hands, but the IDF should get the message that the people in these areas don't feel safe, and that's why this is happening.
So you mentioned Hawara. Just this last week, I traveled on the Hawara bypass.
There's a new road, yeah.
A brand new road, which,
to go around this village, because the road used to go right through the middle of the village.
Yeah, it used to go through. I used to take the road all the time. But again, on one hand, I felt definitely safer taking the bypass road. But on the other hand, this is certainly a Band-Aid. This doesn't solve anything, building bypass roads. And there's a road from Jerusalem now. You can go all the way to Hebron without driving through an Arab village. And it's a Band-Aid. It's a good feeling. Okay, it's a safer road. It's a faster road, but it's definitely not a solution.
I used to live in Beit El and used to drive out there a lot, and those are also bypass roads because the main road to Beit El used to go through Ramallah. The bus used to go through the middle of Ramallah to get to the villages, the Jewish towns in the area. And so Israel built a whole network of bypass roads, but those are shared roads. Those are not Jewish bypass roads. Okay, these are roads that are shared roads. They're like shared highways for Jews and Palestinians, but they do bypass villages. So you don't go right through the middle of an area where there's Arab buildings right up against the road. But how many times have we seen shootings on these bypass roads as well? And on the corner near Givat Asaf, on the corner near the entrance to Ofra, where a friend of mine was shot when she was, the daughter of a friend of mine was shot when she was 7 months pregnant. Her husband was shot too. They were just standing at a bus stop, okay? We see it time and again. Just because there's a bypass road doesn't mean that there's not going to be shootings on the road, and it doesn't mean that these are Jewish-only bypass roads. These are highways that are built to facilitate transport for both Jews and Palestinians living in the area. And you know who's paying for those roads?
Israel.
Not the Palestinian Authority. Israel's paying for them.
Yeah, again, I see this as a Band-Aid, and also I agree with you. It's definitely a false sense of security. So the Arabs have to walk a little further now, go out of the village and come to this new highway and carry out attacks, which you mentioned that they did and they continue to do. But in my opinion, this is not a solution. One last story we have time for here today. The president of Columbia University resigns. Of course, we're talking about for many months all the anti-Israel protests on college campuses, citing a period of turmoil. If I'm pronouncing her name correctly, Minuche Shafek announced last week she was stepping down immediately as president of Columbia University. Under her leadership, Columbia's campus became a place that Jewish faculty and students have said is rife with Jewish hatred and unsafe for Jews. I don't think she's the first to step down. I think other university heads have stepped down, especially after that damning congressional hearing in which these presidents would not even condemn Jewish hatred on campus. So she's the latest to step down. What do you expect, number one, out of this situation, and what do you think we're going to see? I mean, the college semester starts in another week or two, I believe. What do you think is going to happen this fall on college campuses in the U.S.?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Shafik is not the first one to resign. She's the fourth. Claudine Gay, the president of Harvard, resigned. The president of UPenn resigned. The president of Cornell resigned. And now you have the president of Columbia. You have a situation in which we saw the encampments on the campuses, anti-Israel encampments. Many of them were fueled by agitators who weren't even students. On those campuses, you had situations where Jews literally did not feel safe. Jews were being harassed going into buildings. We saw the situation at, I think it was Carnegie Mellon University, where the Jews were basically had to lock themselves in a library because they felt unsafe on the campus. And what's happened finally is that Congress has stepped up and said, this is unacceptable. You had Elise Stefanik, who was leading those congressional hearings and really grilling these university presidents about anti-Semitism on the campus and anti-Semitic incitement, which these, several of the university presidents said, well, it just depends on the context of how they're saying it. If they're just saying it, but they don't have the ability to carry it out, maybe it's not anti-Semitism. And, the situation really got out of control. And Shafik, she managed to withstand, last through the spring semester. But as you mentioned, the fall semester is about to start. So we've had a little bit of a quieting during the summer recess. But if this war continues to go on between Israel and Gaza, through the beginning of the semester, I think that you're going to start to see similar situations erupt on the campuses, and Shafik didn't want to have to deal with it. Now, another part, aside from the Congress really stepping it up, was also the donors. You have a lot of Jewish donors of these universities, and to be fair, I mean, a lot of these Jewish donors are a day late and a dollar short on this because Jewish donors have been putting their names on the science buildings and arts buildings and things like that, while the Qataris and others have come in and said, well, we're going to buy the Middle East studies programs over here. We're going to place the deans. We're going to place the professors. And they've created a situation on campus, and the Jewish donors really didn't do much about it. Finally, a lot of the Jewish donors, especially the bigger ones, are standing up and saying, no, we're not going to pay for education on the campus when education means Jew hatred on campus. And so you had people like Bill Ackman and Mark Rowan and Harley Lipman and some others, at these campuses saying we're going to withdraw our funding from the universities. And a university president's main job is fundraising. So, if they're not able to maintain decorum on the campus, if they're going to be attacked in the press and in Congress, and they're going to start to lose donations, it's probably better just to step down. And that's what happened. But don't assume that whoever replaces this president is necessarily going to be any better than Shafiq, who just stepped down.
Yeah, I was going to say it'll be a true test this coming fall, which actually just starts in a few weeks. And a lot of those funds diverted to Yeshiva University and diverted to universities here in Israel. And we'll have to see what happens at Columbia and all the other college campuses this coming fall semester. And that's going to do it for today. Big shout out to Ryan Lifshitz for everything he does behind the scenes. My name is Josh Hasten, correspondent for JNS News with Alex Traiman, CEO of JNS. Continue to follow all the amazing programming on JNS TV. You can check that out on YouTube. Go to jns.org for all the latest breaking news from here in Israel as we continue to monitor the situation vis-a-vis Iran, Hezbollah, the ceasefire negotiations, and everything else going on. Have a great week and continue to pray for the well-being of the brave men and women of the IDF who continue to defend the state of Israel, the Jewish people, and really defend everything good and humane throughout the world. Have a great week, everybody.